My name is Henry. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe with words like steady, reliable, and sometimes, if they think I won't hear it, predictable. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in financial compliance for a mid-sized logistics firm. I read contracts the way some people read novels. I notice small discrepancies, patterns, numbers that don't belong. It's not a glamorous skill. It doesn't make you the loudest voice in a room, but it makes you observant. Most people assume I'm passive. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. I don't need the last word. In group settings, I'm the one refilling glasses, clearing plates, and asking if everyone got home safely. I learned early that being calm makes other people comfortable. And when people are comfortable, they talk. They reveal themselves without realizing it. For 13 years, I was married to a woman who thrived in brighter light than I ever wanted. She was magnetic, social, effortlessly charming. When we walked into a room together, my eyes went to her. I never minded that. I thought love didn't require symmetry, just loyalty. This story isn't about rage. It isn't about revenge. And it isn't about dramatic confrontations across candlelit tables. It's about something quieter. I found out about the affair through our shared bank account. Not through lipstick on a collar. Not through a late-night confession. Through numbers, late-night charges, unfamiliar restaurants, explanations that never made sense. At first, I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. There always is, if you're willing to stretch far enough. Business dinners, friends in town, random glitches. But numbers don't glitch in patterns. What followed wasn't an explosion. It was a slow internal recalibration, a shift from reacting to observing, from asking questions to collecting answers, from hoping to knowing. People often underestimate what quiet men do when they stop speaking. This is the story of how I went from being the dependable background presence in my own marriage to the one person who fully understood what was happening without raising my voice once. It's about the cost of invisibility and the power hidden inside it. If you've ever suspected something was wrong but chose patience over confrontation, have you ever wondered what silence might actually be building? To my wife, Claire, I was stability. That's the word she used when she introduced me to people. Henry keeps everything grounded. She'd smile when she said it, squeeze my arm lightly as if I were an anchor she appreciated having nearby. I wore that role comfortably for years. In our circle of friends, I was the responsible one. The guy who volunteered to drive. The one who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders. The one who would quietly cover the bill if someone's card declined and never mention it again. If a dinner reservation went wrong, I fixed it. If someone forgot tickets, I printed backups. I was useful. Usefulness is a dangerous identity when you don't question it. At family gatherings, I handled logistics. At holidays, I carved the turkey while everyone else debated politics. At parties, I drifted to the kitchen to wash glasses while conversations grew louder in the living room. No one asked me what I thought about things unless the topic was mortgages, interest rates, or tax brackets. And I didn't resent that. I believed that contribution didn't require attention. Claire, on the other hand, filled spaces with ease. She told stories with movement hands expressive, voice animated. People leaned toward her. They laughed harder at her jokes. When she walked into a restaurant, she seemed to brighten it. We looked balanced from the outside. What no one really noticed, including me, at first was how often I deferred. Where do you want to eat? Whatever you prefer. Should we host or just attend? Whatever works for you. Do you mind if I'm out late Thursday? Of course not. I told myself that flexibility was maturity, that choosing not to argue was a strength. I grew up in a house where raised voices meant damage. My father believed volume equaled authority. My mother survived by staying quiet. I learned early that calm preserved peace, so I became calm. Claire used to tease me about it. You never get jealous, she'd say. You're impossible to provoke. She'd say it like it was a compliment. But sometimes I caught a flicker behind her eyes, almost like disappointment, as if she wanted proof that she could move me. But I wasn't detached. I just processed internally. If something bothered me, I sat with it, analyzed it, broke it down like a spreadsheet until it made sense. In social settings, people sometimes talked over me. Not intentionally, just habitually. Claire would jump in mid-sentence to finish a thought I hadn't completed. Friends would redirect conversations without realizing I'd been speaking. And I would stop, not because I agreed, not because I lacked opinion, but because I calculated the cost of insisting. It always seemed higher than the benefit. I don't think anyone meant to make me invisible. Invisibility is rarely assigned deliberately. It happens gradually when someone proves they won't fight for space. I didn't fight for space. At work, that restraint translated into promotions. Quiet competence earns trust in compliance. At home, it translated into predictability. Claire once described me to a friend as unshakable. At the time, I took it as admiration. Now I understand something different when people believe you're unshakable. They sometimes stop worrying about shaking you. And when someone believes you'll always absorb impact without reaction, they test the limits of that assumption. I didn't know then that the role I'd so carefully embodied, steady, calm, accommodating, was slowly becoming permission. Permission to overlook, permission to dismiss, permission to risk. And the most dangerous part, I didn't see the shift because I believed being underestimated was harmless. I thought invisibility meant safety. I was wrong. The first time something felt off, it wasn't dramatic. It was a Thursday night in early October. Claire had told me she was meeting a former client for drinks networking, she'd said casually while adjusting an earring in the hallway mirror. I remember, because it was one of the few nights I'd planned to cook something that required timing. A risotto. The kind that demands attention. She kissed my cheek before leaving. Light. Quick. Distracted. Around 10:47 p.m. My phone buzzed with a standard transaction alert from our joint bank account. We'd set those up years ago for large purchases. It wasn't large, but the restaurant name caught my attention. It wasn't somewhere near her office. It was across town. An upscale place known more for anniversary dinners than networking drinks. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe the client picked the place. Maybe there was a group. Maybe location didn't matter. At 12:36, another charge appeared. Same restaurant. Different amount. That was unusual. Restaurants don't typically process multiple separate charges unless something is split or extended. When Claire came home after one, she smelled like a different perfume. Not stronger, just unfamiliar. Something warmer, spicier. I noticed because I'm sensitive to patterns, and her usual scent was floral. How was it, I asked from the couch, keeping my tone neutral. Good, she said, slipping off her heels. Long. He talked a lot. I repeated gently. Yeah. Just him. She walked toward the bathroom before I could respond. That was the first small cut. Not because she met a man. That wasn't the issue. Claire worked in marketing. Dinners happened. Clients existed. It was the way the detail arrived. Too quickly. Like it had been prepared. The next morning, she overslept. She never overslept. When I mentioned the restaurant casually, while pouring coffee, she blinked for half a second too long. Oh. Yeah. He picked it. She said, bit much, honestly, but her tone didn't match the words. There was no eye roll. No amusement. Just compression. I nodded. Most people would have let it go. In fact, most people did. When she mentioned the dinner to friends later that weekend, no one asked questions. They teased her about wine and dining clients. They laughed. I watched. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't betrayal. It was a hairline fracture in consistency. And here's the part I need to be honest about. I wanted to ignore it. Not because I was afraid. But acknowledging something wrong requires energy. Confrontation reshapes dynamics. It introduces instability. I valued stability, so I archived the moment mentally. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. Over the next few weeks, small inconsistencies accumulated. A delayed response to texts when she was out with co-workers. A sudden new interest in fitness classes on Tuesday nights. A credit card statement with 2 identical rideshare charges, 20 minutes apart. Each one alone was harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. But I didn't accuse. I didn't interrogate. I didn't check her phone or follow her car. I did something quieter. I paid attention. And that was the difference between being passive and being observant. The first small cut doesn't bleed dramatically. It just reminds you that skin can break. The real question is what you do when you realize it has. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat softly until you either name them or absorb them. I absorbed them. After that first October dinner, the late nights became less unusual. Not frequent enough to alarm anyone. just consistent enough to feel intentional. Every 10 days, then every week, then twice in 1 week, followed by a stretch of domestic attentiveness as if balance had to be restored. Claire became slightly more affectionate on mornings after she'd been out. Not dramatically, just calibrated. A hand lingering on my shoulder. A compliment about how lucky she was to have someone so steady. It almost felt like maintenance. If I mentioned the time, she'd laugh lightly. "You're not tracking me, are you?" she'd tease. And I would smile. "No, just making sure you got home safe." That answer always seemed to satisfy her. Our friends noticed nothing. Or maybe they noticed and dismissed it. It's easier that way. At a dinner party in November, someone joked about how Claire had the most active social life in the group. "She keeps me young," I said evenly. Everyone laughed. Later that night, as we drove home, she said, "You don't mind, right, me being out more lately?" It was framed as reassurance, but it was also a test. "I trust you," I said, and at that moment, I meant it in the most literal sense. I trusted that whatever was happening would eventually reveal itself. Here's the subtle shift that took me longer to understand. Her explanations started arriving before my questions. If she was late, she'd text a reason I hadn't requested. If there was a charge on the account, she'd mention it casually the next day. Over-explaining is its own kind of signal. Once, I asked about a Saturday afternoon she'd said she spent shopping. I'd noticed a hotel parking charge brief, under 2 hours. "Oh, that," she said quickly. "I met Jenna there. She was staying for a conference. I didn't tell you, it was last minute." She held eye contact just a fraction too steadily. I nodded. I could have asked Jenna casually later. I didn't, because by then, something inside me had shifted from seeking reassurance to observing behavior. Disrespect doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like an assumption. She began assuming I wouldn't dig deeper, assuming my calm meant indifference, assuming my silence meant ignorance. At holiday gatherings, she'd interrupt me more frequently, correct small details in my stories, finish my sentences with slight inaccuracies. "You're remembering it wrong," she'd say lightly, in front of others, and I'd let it pass, not because I agreed, but because I was measuring something larger. The truth is, I rationalized my quiet. I told myself that marriages go through phases, that independence is healthy, that suspicion without proof is paranoia. I told myself that mature love doesn't require possession. But beneath all that reasoning was a quieter realization she was becoming bolder, not reckless, not sloppy, just comfortable. Comfortable in the belief that I would never disrupt the equilibrium. And here's what most people misunderstand about quiet men: we don't stay silent because we're unaware. We stay silent because we're deciding. Every late-night charge, every rehearsed explanation, every subtle correction in public, I logged them mentally, not to build a case, but to understand the shape of the truth. Disrespect normalized is far more dangerous than disrespect declared. When something becomes routine, it stops feeling wrong. It becomes background noise, and I had spent my entire life being comfortable in the background. The difference now was this: I was no longer background in my own mind. I was watching, and she had no idea. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you've been cast, not chosen cast. The realization came quietly one Sunday afternoon while we were hosting brunch. Claire moved through the kitchen with practiced charm, laughing too brightly at a story one of our friends told. I was at the stove, flipping pancakes, refilling mimosas, managing timing like I always did. At some point, someone asked Claire how she balanced everything: work, friends, marriage. She smiled and gestured vaguely toward me. "Henry handles the serious stuff. I just make life interesting." Everyone laughed. It was meant to be playful, but something in the phrasing settled differently this time. Henry handles the serious stuff. Translation bills, insurance, repairs, long-term planning, emotional steadiness, crisis absorption. I was infrastructure, necessary, reliable, invisible, later, while loading the dishwasher. I replayed small moments from the past year, not the suspicious ones, the relational ones. The way she'd roll her eyes gently when I double-checked travel details. The way she'd call me my spreadsheet husband in front of friends. The way decisions about vacations, furniture, even social plans were increasingly framed as her preferences with the assumption I'd adapt. It wasn't contempt. It was categorization. She had assigned me a role: the stable one, the safe one, the one who doesn't react. And once someone defines you that way, they begin testing how stable you really are. I thought back to something she'd said months earlier after a minor argument, if you could even call it that. "You're impossible to fight with," she'd said. "Frustrated. You just absorb everything." At the time, I believed that was a strength. Now I heard something else beneath it. Absorb everything. If you absorb impact without a visible consequence, people forget impact exists. That Sunday afternoon, after our friends left, she scrolled through her phone on the couch while I wiped down the counters. "You're quiet," she said without looking up. "Just thinking." "About?" I paused. Not because I didn't have an answer, because I was choosing which version of myself to give her. "About how routines form," I said finally. She laughed lightly. "You're so analytical." And that was it. Dismissed as personality. The role had been written long before the late-night charges began. I just hadn't seen it. I was the man who would never check the bank statements with suspicion. The husband who wouldn't question a hotel parking charge. The partner who prioritized calm over confrontation. She wasn't afraid of getting caught. She was confident I wouldn't disrupt the script. And here's the truth that changed everything: roles only persist if you continue performing them. That evening, while she showered, I sat at my desk with the laptop open. Not to spy, not to invade privacy, to understand. I reviewed 12 months of joint account activity. Not obsessively, methodically. Dates, times, locations, frequency. No conclusions yet, just data. For the first time, I wasn't responding emotionally to isolated moments. I was evaluating a pattern. There's power in stepping outside the character others have written for you. Not loudly, not dramatically, just internally. Because once you see the role, you can decide whether to keep playing it. That Sunday wasn't when I confronted her. It was when I stopped being who she thought I was, and she never noticed the shift. It wasn't the biggest charge that changed me. It wasn't even the most obvious one. It was a Tuesday afternoon transaction for $187.43 at a boutique hotel bar downtown. 3:18 p.m., middle of the workday. Claire had told me that morning she was in back-to-back strategy meetings until 6. I remember staring at the timestamp longer than I needed to. Not because it proved anything dramatic, but because it removed the last comfortable explanation. This wasn't a networking dinner ambiguity. This wasn't lost track of time. This was deliberate. I didn't feel rage. That's the part people expect when they hear stories like this. A spike of adrenaline, a shattered glass, a confrontation before the sun sets. What I felt instead was alignment. For months, small inconsistencies had been floating like loose puzzle pieces. That timestamp clicked them into place. I closed the laptop slowly and sat back in my chair. If you've ever had a moment where your intuition and the evidence finally agree, you know the feeling. It isn't loud. It's settling. There was grief in it. Yes, but also clarity. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands weren't shaking. My breathing was steady. I was aware almost clinically of the quiet recalibration happening inside me. This was no longer suspicion. It was reality. When Claire came home that evening, she kissed me the same way she always did, brief, distracted, affectionate enough to check the box. "How were the meetings?" I asked. "Exhausting," she sighed. "Didn't even have time for lunch." I nodded. There it was. The lie. Simple. Unembellished. And something in me shifted permanently. Not because she lied. People lie for many reasons: fear, confusion, selfishness. What shifted was my understanding of the dynamic between us. She believed I would accept the version of reality she presented. She believed I wouldn't verify. She believed my calm was unconditional. That night, I didn't withdraw. I didn't confront. I didn't act colder or distant. I made dinner. We talked about her upcoming presentation. I listened the way I always had. But internally, I made a decision that would shape everything after. I would no longer seek emotional reassurance from someone who was actively distorting the truth. Instead, I would seek clarity. There's a difference. Reassurance asks, "Is this okay?" Clarity asks, "What is real?" I chose clarity. Over the next few days, I began separating feelings from facts. I allowed myself to grieve privately the version of our marriage I thought existed. The trust I assumed was mutual. But I didn't spiral. I didn't catastrophize. I observed. I noticed how relaxed she was around me. How easily she left her phone on the counter. How confidently she scheduled late meetings. That confidence wasn't arrogance. It was certainty that I wouldn't challenge her. And here's what most people misunderstand about quiet men when we stop reacting. It doesn't mean we've given up. Sometimes it means we've moved to a different phase entirely. On Thursday of that week, while reviewing our retirement contributions, something I handled annually, I adjusted nothing. But I began researching the separation of assets. Not divorce. Not yet. Information. Understanding what disentanglement would require if it ever became necessary. Not out of vengeance. Out of preparation. Because once something shifts internally, you can't unsee it. And the day that the hotel bar charge appeared wasn't the day I lost control. It was the day I regained it. Quietly. Completely. There's a version of silence that comes from fear. And then there's a version that comes from control. Mine changed. Before, I stayed quiet to preserve harmony. I avoided confrontation because I believed peace was fragile. I thought if I introduced suspicion into the air, everything we had built might crack under the weight of it. Now, I stayed quiet for a different reason. I wanted to see how far she would go without resistance. It wasn't a game. It wasn't manipulation. It was observation without interference, like watching a system operate when no one knows it's being evaluated. Claire began spending more time with clients. The Tuesday fitness classes stretched later into the evening. There were weekends where she'd step out for errands that required careful outfits and subtle perfume changes. I noticed everything. I commented on nothing. And something interesting happened. Her comfort increased. She stopped over-explaining as much. The rehearsed justifications softened. It was as if my continued calm confirmed her original assessment of me: steady, unquestioning, unshakable. One evening, she came home almost glowing. Not guilty, not anxious. Just energized in a way that hadn't been about us in a long time. "You're in a good mood," I observed gently. "Am I?" She smiled, slipping off her jacket. "Seems like it. Maybe I just had a productive day. Maybe." I nodded and returned to slicing vegetables. From the outside, nothing had changed. We still had dinner together. We still watched shows on the couch. We still discussed weekend plans. But inside, I had shifted from participant to analyst, and that shift gave me space. Silence, when chosen deliberately, creates room for clarity. Without constant questioning or emotional escalation, patterns reveal themselves naturally. People relax into their behavior when they feel unchallenged. I wasn't pretending ignorance. I was allowing truth to mature. At work, I handled compliance audits the same way. You don't accuse immediately. You observe. You collect. You let discrepancies repeat until they confirm themselves. Emotion clouds precision, and precision was what I needed. One Saturday morning, I made coffee while Claire slept, in a rare occurrence now after late nights. I looked at her phone on the counter, face down. No password barrier between me and the answers if I choose that route. I didn't touch it, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, because I didn't need to. Evidence gathered ethically carries a different weight than evidence snatched impulsively. I wasn't interested in dramatic discovery. I was interested in an irrefutable understanding. That distinction mattered to me. Over the next few weeks, I began adjusting small things in my own life. I reconnected with an old colleague about a potential job opportunity in another branch of the company. I scheduled a solo weekend hiking trip under the pretense of needing time outdoors. Claire didn't object. In fact, she seemed relieved. "You should do more things for yourself," she said lightly. I almost smiled at the irony. Silence, in her mind, meant I was content, that I was evolving into independence without friction. In reality, silence meant I was repositioning. There's a subtle power in letting someone believe their narrative about you while you quietly build a different one underneath it. She mistook my restraint for weakness, but restraint, when deliberate, is leverage waiting to be used. And by the time she realized my silence wasn't surrender, it would already be too late to adjust her strategy. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. Claire didn't notice when I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor under the guise of long-term portfolio optimization. She didn't question why I wanted a clearer breakdown of our shared assets versus individually titled ones. After all, I had always been the one who handled the serious stuff. Our advisor assumed it was proactive planning. In a way, it was. I asked neutral questions. If one spouse were to separate, how would liquidity be managed? What documentation typically speeds up asset division? How are joint accounts best unwound without triggering unnecessary penalties? I framed everything hypothetically, because technically, It was at home. Nothing shifted in tone. I still asked about her day. I still remember her presentation dates. I still cooked twice a week. But while she expanded her world outward, I began consolidating mine inward. I created a private digital folder, secure, encrypted, nothing invasive. Inside it, I placed bank statements, timestamped transaction logs, calendar overlaps, not obsessive, just chronological. When late-night charges aligned with early morning workouts, I noted it. When hotel bar tabs coincided with out-of-town conferences she hadn't mentioned, I documented it. Not for court, for clarity. There's a difference between suspicion and documentation. Suspicion is emotional. Documentation is factual. One evening, while she showered, I transferred a portion of my direct deposit into a new individual savings account. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would cause alarms. Just enough to establish independence over time. The next paycheck, I did the same. Gradual, predictable, invisible. At work, I formally applied for a transfer to our Seattle office, something I had considered years ago but shelved for convenience. The role offered slightly more responsibility and slightly higher compensation. Enough to justify the move professionally. I didn't tell Claire immediately. There was no deception in that, just timing. Meanwhile, I began re-engaging socially in subtle ways. I accepted invitations I would have declined before. I reconnected with my sister for longer phone calls. I spent a Saturday helping a colleague renovate his deck. Claire commented on it once. "You've been busy lately." "Just diversifying," I said lightly. She laughed, assuming it was a financial joke. The truth was more structural than that. I was diversifying emotionally, because here's something I understood clearly by then: if the marriage ended, the shock wouldn't come from betrayal, it would come from disorientation. She believed the foundation was fixed, that no matter what she explored outside of it, the home base remained stable. What she never noticed was that foundations can be reinforced or relocated. One night in January, I reviewed 6 months of data in that encrypted folder. Patterns had solidified. The Tuesday fitness classes always coincided with a particular parking structure near the same boutique hotel. The rideshare routes traced identical start and end points repeatedly. There was no ambiguity left. I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time. Not grieving, not angry, just acknowledging the full shape of reality. And in that acknowledgement, something unexpected surfaced: relief. Relief that the uncertainty was gone. Relief that intuition had not betrayed me. Relief that my calm hadn't been naivety, but patience. Preparation changes posture. It changes how you move through rooms. I suspect she sensed something different in me during those months. Not distance, but solidity. Once, during dinner, she studied me for a moment longer than usual. "You're different lately," she said. "How? I don't know. Just centered. I've always been centered." She smiled. True, but she didn't realize the difference. Before, my center was built around us. Now, it was built around truth. And truth, once fully seen, doesn't require urgency. It requires timing. Everything I did during those months was invisible because it didn't disrupt her narrative. She still saw the reliable husband, the steady provider, the calm presence. What she never noticed was that the quiet man in the kitchen had already begun designing his exit ethically, strategically, and without spectacle. Preparation isn't loud, it's deliberate, and by the time preparation is complete, the outcome often feels inevitable. The truth didn't explode into my life. It unfolded. There was no single dramatic moment, no lipstick on a collar, no accidental text lighting up the screen while we were watching television. Instead, the reveal came the way most real betrayals do, quietly, through convergence. It was a Friday afternoon when everything aligned. Claire had mentioned a client off-site workshop scheduled at a co-working space across town. Casual tone, light detail, just enough to sound ordinary. At 2:11 p.m, a rideshare charge appeared. Pick-up near her office, drop-off location tagged at the same boutique hotel bar I'd already logged half a dozen times. At 5:42 p.m, another rideshare originating from that hotel, heading not to the co-working space she'd described, but to a residential neighborhood 30 minutes north. A neighborhood I recognized, not because I had driven there, because I had traced it before on a map, months earlier, when similar charges formed a pattern. That area had one defining landmark: a cluster of modern townhouses built 3 years ago. High privacy, limited foot traffic, underground parking. I didn't act immediately. I didn't confront her. I didn't even check her phone. I opened my laptop. I cross-referenced dates, times, locations, calendar entries, financial statements. It wasn't obsessive, it was systematic. And when laid out cleanly, the pattern was undeniable. Twice a week, sometimes 3. Consistent time blocks, predictable routes, matching restaurant charges, hotel bar tabs that preceded those rides. There was no longer a narrative gap to fill with the benefit of the doubt. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't emotional confusion. It was a sustained, deliberate relationship running parallel to our marriage. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. And what surprised me most was not devastation. It was stillness. Clarity has weight, but it also has calm. For months, I had been operating in the space between suspicion and confirmation. That space drains energy. It keeps your mind half engaged, half doubting. Now there was nothing left to doubt. I didn't know his name. I didn't need to. I didn't know what she told him about me. I didn't need to. All I needed to know was that my marriage existed in 2 versions, one presented to me and one enacted elsewhere. That evening, when she came home, she looked radiant, effortless, relaxed. How was the workshop, I asked. The same way I'd asked about dozens of fabricated meetings before. Productive, she said. Long day. I nodded and passed her a glass of water. In that moment, I understood something essential: confrontation would not bring clarity. Clarity had already arrived. Confrontation would bring noise. And noise benefits the person who has been managing 2 realities. It creates space for deflection, for emotional fog, for rewriting timelines. I wasn't interested in noise. I was interested in decisions. That night, after she fell asleep, I drafted an email to a family law attorney recommended by a colleague years ago. I didn't send it immediately. I read it 3 times first. Measured, factual, no accusations. Just a request for consultation regarding asset protection and separation options. Then I sent it. There was no rush of adrenaline, no shaking hands, just completion. The private reveal isn't the moment you catch someone. It's the moment you stop needing to. I didn't feel hatred toward her. What I felt was distance. Distance from the version of us I had defended internally for months. Distance from the assumption that loyalty was symmetrical. And strangely, gratitude. Gratitude that I had seen the truth before reacting. Grateful that I had prepared quietly instead of exploding prematurely. Gratitude that my silence had not been weakness but incubation. The next morning, I made breakfast like always. Eggs, toast, coffee. Routine is powerful camouflage. She had no idea that the foundation beneath her certainty had already shifted, and I had no intention of announcing it. Not yet, because once you see everything clearly, you realize timing matters more than revelation. And I was done reacting. I was ready to choose. The consultation call lasted 43 minutes. I took it from my car during lunch, parked beneath a row of bare winter trees outside the office. The attorney's voice was calm, clinical, unsurprised. He had heard variations of this story many times before. I presented facts, not feelings. Length of marriage 13 years. Joint assets home. Retirement accounts. Shared investments. Children none. Evidence of infidelity, documented financial patterns. No confrontation yet. He didn't ask if I was sure. He asked what I wanted. That question lingered longer than any legal advice he gave. What did I want? Revenge wasn't on the list. Public exposure wasn't either. I wasn't interested in humiliating her or dismantling her career or turning friends into jurors. I wanted clarity, and I wanted control over how my life unfolded next. The attorney outlined options. Confront first. Attempt reconciliation. Possibly restructure assets later. File immediately. Serve papers without warning. Or begin formal separation, quietly secure finances. Document evidence. Then initiate when strategically appropriate. Each path carried consequences. Confrontation would satisfy emotion. It might also trigger denial, anger, and narrative distortion. She could preemptively move funds, shift stories, prepare her own version of events. Immediate filing would be decisive but abrupt. It would ignite conflict without groundwork laid socially or logistically. The third option required patience. Patience had always been my strength. After the call ended, I sat in the silence of the car and examined myself honestly. Was there any part of me that wanted to salvage the marriage? If she confessed tomorrow, cried, apologized, would I rebuild? The answer surfaced without drama. No, not because I was incapable of forgiveness, But because trust, once recalibrated at this depth, does not return to its original structure, it becomes something else, something negotiated, cautious, uneven. I didn't want to spend the next decade monitoring. I wanted equilibrium, so I chose the irreversible path, not immediately visible, but irreversible in intention. I would finalize the Seattle transfer. I would continue shifting portions of my income into individual reserves legally, transparently. I would gather 12 full months of documented financial discrepancies, and then, when timing aligned professionally and legally, I would file no announcement, no emotional debate, just action. That evening, Claire mentioned a weekend trip she was considering with co-workers in early spring. "You should go," I said evenly. She studied me for a second, as if searching for subtext. There was none, because the decision I had made wasn't reactive to her next move. It was anchored in my own. There's a moment in every betrayal narrative where the injured party decides who they are going to be. The explosive one, the pleading one, the vindictive one. I chose something quieter. I chose finality without spectacle. And once that choice settled, an unexpected calm followed. When you stop trying to save something that no longer exists in its original form, your energy returns to you. I slept deeply that night, not because the situation was resolved, but because my direction was. The decision point isn't about catching someone in the act. It's about catching yourself in clarity. And I had, from that point forward, everything I did would move in one direction. Forward. Once the decision was made, action became procedural. There's something stabilizing about procedure. It removes drama from motion. The Seattle transfer was approved in late February. The promotion came with it a moderate salary increase, expanded oversight responsibilities, enough to justify relocation without raising suspicion. When I told Claire, I framed it as an opportunity. "They've been encouraging me to step into a broader compliance role for years," I said over dinner. "This one just aligns." She blinked, surprised but not alarmed. "Seattle," she asked. "That's big." "It is. For how long?" "Indefinitely. Unless I decline." Silence stretched between us. I let it. "You'd really want to move?" she asked carefully. "I'd want to grow." That was the first honest sentence that carried weight. She didn't fully register. She suggested we discuss logistics later. I agreed. In parallel, I met with the attorney in person. We reviewed documentation, 12 months of financial records, ride-share routes, repeated hotel expenditures, timeline correlations. He didn't need emotional commentary. The data spoke clearly. In our state, no-fault divorce meant infidelity wasn't required for filing, but documentation supported negotiation leverage if needed. It discouraged narrative manipulation. I authorized the preparation of papers, not filing yet. Preparation. At home, I initiated subtle structural changes. I refinanced the mortgage 6 months earlier than planned, locking in favorable terms that simplified equity division later. Entirely legal. Entirely transparent. Claire thanked me for being on top of things. I opened an individual credit line in my name only. Established independent utilities accounts for the future relocation. Shifted automatic bill payments into clearer categories. Each move was incremental. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger panic. People imagine strategic action as aggressive. It isn't. It's organized. Meanwhile, Claire's routines continued uninterrupted. The Tuesday evenings, the occasional weekend team retreat, the perfume variations. Once, she asked casually, "You don't seem bothered by the move." "I've thought about it for a long time." I said, that was true, just not in the way she assumed. What she interpreted as ambition was actually disentanglement. In early March, I signed a lease on a Seattle apartment beginning in June. Small, modern, quiet neighborhood near the water. I didn't tell her immediately. Relocation packages often included temporary housing. The details weren't urgent. The attorney finalized the paperwork the same week. I reviewed every line slowly. Division of assets. Proposed timeline. Temporary separation terms. No hostility in language. No accusations. Just clarity. The filing date was set for the first Monday in April. A month before my official transfer. Timing mattered. By then, funds were positioned. Documentation secured. Professional relocation established. On the outside, our marriage still looked stable. We attended a friend's birthday party that Saturday. Claire laughed easily. Introduced me proudly as the soon-to-be Seattle executive. I smiled politely. No one sensed a fracture. That's the power of quiet preparation. Outcomes form beneath the surface long before they appear. The night before filing, I stood in the kitchen alone, hands resting on the counter. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. I had moved carefully, legally, ethically. I had given myself space to reconsider at every stage. And I hadn't. Silence had not been hesitation. It had been under construction. And in less than 48 hours, the consequences of that construction would begin unfolding whether she understood them immediately or not. The papers were served on a Tuesday afternoon. Not at home. At her office. I chose that deliberately, not to embarrass her, but to prevent emotional escalation in private. Public spaces regulate behavior. They create a pause where chaos might otherwise bloom. I was at work when my attorney confirmed delivery. Professional. Uneventful, he said. She was surprised. Of course she was. Surprise only exists when someone believes the ground beneath them is stable. Claire called 32 minutes later. I let it ring once before answering. "What is this?" she asked. Not yelling. Not crying. Just stunned. "It's paperwork," I said calmly. "Henry." "Yes." "You filed?" "Yes." A long silence followed. I could hear office noise faintly behind her muffled conversations. A printer cycling. Why, she asked finally. It wasn't defensive. It was genuinely confused. That question told me everything. She didn't think we were in danger. "I think we both know why." I said. Another silence. "This one is heavier." "You're overreacting," she said quietly. Not angrily, almost reflexively. "I don't think I am." She exhaled sharply. "We haven't even talked about this. I've been listening for months." The line went quiet. This is the part where people expect confrontation to escalate. Accusations. Denials. Emotional eruptions. It didn't happen that way, because she didn't yet know what I knew or how much. That uncertainty changed her tone. "Can we talk tonight?" she asked. Yes. When I came home, she was sitting at the dining table, papers spread in front of her like unfamiliar blueprints. "You blindsided me," she said. I considered that word. "Did I?" I asked gently. Her eyes searched mine not for anger, but for recognition. For the version of me that would soften under pressure. He wasn't there anymore. "This is about the move," she tried. "No." Her composure cracked slightly. "Then what?" I met her gaze evenly. "It's about truth." There it was. The pivot point. She didn't confess. She didn't deny. She hesitated. That hesitation was louder than any admission. "You've been distant," she said instead. "You didn't say you were unhappy." I wasn't distant. I replied, "I was observing." The word landed between us. Observing. She understood then that this wasn't impulsive. Her shoulders dropped not in relief, but in recalculation. For the first time in months, I saw uncertainty in her posture. Not because I had shouted, not because I had accused her of specific acts, but because the narrative she'd constructed, steady husband, predictable foundation, no longer applied. Consequences rarely feel like explosions at first. They feel like disorientation. That night, she slept in the guest room. Not angrily, quietly. Over the next few days, friends began texting me not with outrage, but confusion. Claire had shared that I'd suddenly decided to end things, that I was going through something. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself publicly. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require immediate audience approval. It requires alignment with yourself. At work, I continued as usual. "In 2 weeks, I will relocate. At home, tension settled like fog, not loud, just present. Claire moved through the house carefully now, studying me, reassessing. The consequences had begun. Not chaotic, not dramatic, but irreversible. And for the first time since October, she was the one operating without full visibility. Panic doesn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it looks like sudden enthusiasm. The week after she was served, Claire shifted tactics. She cooked dinner 3 nights in a row, something she hadn't done consistently in years. She suggested we revisit our favorite hiking trail. She brought up memories from early in our marriage with careful nostalgia, as if placing photographs on a table one by one. "Remember that little cabin in Bend?" she asked one evening, leaning against the counter while I made tea. "We were so broke, so happy." "I remember," I said. "We could get back there," she added softly. The phrasing was subtle. "Back there." As if the distance between us were accidental. As if we had simply wandered off course together. But we hadn't wandered. She had divided. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her version of events. I just listened. A few days later, The first crack in her composure surfaced. Are you seeing someone, she asked suddenly while we were clearing dishes? No. Then why are you doing this? There it was again. Confusion framed as disbelief. I dried my hands slowly. Because I know. Her face changed, not dramatically, but enough. A flicker. A tightening around the eyes. Know what she asked carefully. I held her gaze. Steady. Enough. Silence expanded across the kitchen. She looked down first. That was the closest we came to confession. Not words. Not admission. Recognition. You should have talked to me, she said finally. Voice thinner now. I gave you space to talk. I replied. You filled it with other things. She inhaled sharply, as if preparing to argue. Then stopped. What could she say that I was wrong? Were the hotel charges a coincidence that the rideshare routes were misunderstood? Denial requires confidence, and she didn't have it. Over the next week, her composure eroded in quieter ways. She stayed home more. Checked in about my relocation details with unfamiliar urgency. When exactly are you leaving? Have you signed anything permanent? Is there any room to pause this? Pause. That word carries hope, but paperwork doesn't pause easily once motion begins. Financial separations were already structured. My Seattle lease was active. My transfer date is locked. I don't want this to end like this, she said one night from the doorway of the guest room. How did you expect it to end? I asked gently. She didn't answer. Because the honest answer would have required acknowledging that she never expected it to end at all. She expected continuation. Parallel lives sustained by my stability. That was the miscalculation. There's a unique kind of regret that surfaces when someone realizes they underestimated you, not your intelligence, but your threshold. She hadn't believed I had one. Now she was discovering I did. Friends began reaching out more directly. A few hinted that Claire was devastated, that she didn't see it coming. I didn't engage in narrative battles. I didn't expose details. I didn't need to win socially. My peace wasn't dependent on public validation. The final mediation session was scheduled for late April. By then, we were living in the same house but moving like polite strangers. Too late to fix it doesn't mean there isn't emotion. It means the decision has passed the point where emotion can alter the outcome. One evening, she stood in the hallway as I packed a box of books. Was there anything I could have said? She asked quietly. I paused. Yes, I said. She waited. The truth. Her eyes filled not dramatically, just enough to reflect understanding. But understanding arrived after structure had solidified. And structure, once set, does not bend easily. It was too late not because forgiveness was impossible, but because respect, once fractured deliberately, does not reassemble under pressure. And I had already stepped forward. The real confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before I left for Seattle. The house was half-packed. Boxes lined the hallway. The air carried that strange in-between feeling like a hotel room you've already checked out of emotionally. Claire asked if we could sit down just once, properly. We sat across from each other at the dining table, where we'd hosted birthdays, holidays, and friends who believed we were solid. There was no audience now, no lawyers, she said softly, just us. I nodded. She folded her hands together, then unfolded them. A rare tell. Claire was usually composed. I need to understand, she began. When did you decide? Months ago. Her eyes flickered. Before the move, yes, she inhaled slowly. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you fight? It was an honest question. Because I wasn't interested in fighting. I said, I was interested in truth. You could have asked me. I didn't need to. The sentence landed heavier than intended. Not cruel, just final. Her jaw tightened slightly. So you just investigated me. I observed patterns, I replied calmly. Financial ones. Repeated ones. That was the closest I came to specifics. She looked down at the table. A long silence stretched between us, not hostile, but exposed. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, she said quietly. I didn't react. That sentence carries more weight than people realize. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, not to her, but it meant something to me. It meant something, I said evenly. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. There was no dramatic confession, no timeline breakdown, no name spoken. We both understood the outline. I never thought you'd leave, she admitted. That was the most honest thing she'd said all afternoon. I know, I replied. She looked up sharply, not defensive, just startled. You knew. Yes. And that didn't make you angry. I was disappointed. I said, anger fades, disappointment clarifies. She absorbed that. For years, She had believed my calm meant endless tolerance, that my steadiness meant permanence regardless of circumstances. Now she was sitting across from the same calm, but it carried a different meaning. "I did love you," she said. "I know. And you don't anymore." I considered the question carefully. "I love who I thought we were." I answered, "But I can't love something that isn't real." Tears gathered in her eyes, not dramatic, not theatrical, just human. "I would have ended it," she whispered. Eventually I asked gently. She didn't answer. That silence was enough. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no moral grandstanding, just acknowledgement. Confrontation without heat feels different from what people imagine. It isn't explosive. It's clarifying. It strips away narrative and leaves only consequence. When we stood from the table, something unspoken settled between us. Not hatred, not even bitterness. Acceptance. She had tested the assumption that I would never leave. I had proven that assumption wrong. Quietly, as I carried another box toward the hallway, she said my name. I turned. "I underestimated you." I gave a small nod. "Yes," I said, and that was the end of it. Seattle feels different in the mornings. There's a stillness near the water just after sunrise, the kind that doesn't ask anything from you. No history, no expectations, just space. My apartment is smaller than the house we shared, but it's intentional. Clean lines, minimal furniture. A desk near the window where light moves slowly across the floor each afternoon. For the first few weeks after the move, people expected me to fall apart. Colleagues were careful with their tone. Friends checked in with subtle curiosity masked as concern. Even my sister called more frequently, listening for cracks in my voice. There weren't any. That doesn't mean there wasn't grief. There was, but grief, when processed without denial, doesn't destroy you. It reshapes you. The biggest shift wasn't external. It was an internal recalibration. For most of my life, I believed that being steady meant absorbing. That calm required tolerance. That strength meant endurance. Now I understand something more precisely. Steadiness without boundaries becomes permission. Calm without consequence becomes invisibility. Endurance without evaluation becomes self-erasure. I'm still quiet. That hasn't changed. I still listen more than I speak. I still analyze before reacting. I still believe that drama solves very little. But there's a difference now. My calm is no longer automatic. It's chosen. At work, the Seattle role has expanded quickly. Increased oversight. Larger decisions. I find clarity in complexity. I always have. Only now. That clarity extends beyond spreadsheets. Socially, I move differently. 2. I don't over-accommodate. I don't default to whatever you prefer. Small things but meaningful. Where do you want to eat? Here's what I'm in the mood for. Do you mind if we reschedule? That doesn't work for me. Simple sentences, direct, unapologetic. I've started hiking alone most Sundays. There's a trail north of the city that climbs gradually before opening into a view of the Sound. The first time I reached the top, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't lonely. I was unburdened. Claire and I finalized everything through mediation. Clean division. No courtroom theatrics. No public fallout. We exchanged a few emails after the kind that acknowledged shared history without attempting to rewrite it. There's no bitterness when I think of her now. Only recognition. She didn't destroy me. She revealed the places where I had allowed myself to disappear. That revelation was uncomfortable but necessary. Who I am now isn't louder. I'm not suddenly charismatic or dominant in rooms, but I occupy space differently. I don't assume loyalty without reciprocity. I don't confuse patience with passivity. I don't confuse silence with surrender. There's a version of quiet that shrinks, and there's a version that anchors. I used to shrink to maintain peace. Now I anchor to maintain truth. And the difference between those two states changes everything. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be waiting for a final twist, a dramatic confession, a public downfall, a moment where everything circles back with spectacle. There isn't one. Real power rarely announces itself. I didn't win because Claire lost. I didn't walk away triumphant. I walked away aligned. That's different. When I found out about the affair through our shared bank account, through late-night charges, unfamiliar restaurants, and explanations that never made sense, I had two choices. React immediately, or understand completely. I chose understanding, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because clarity creates cleaner endings than chaos ever could. There's a misconception that quiet people are unaware, that calm equals compliance. That patience equals weakness. Sometimes quiet is simply timing. Sometimes calm is containment. Sometimes patience is preparation. The lesson here isn't about infidelity. It isn't even about marriage. It's about boundaries. If you never define them, someone else will. If you never enforce them, someone else will test them. If you never value your own stability, someone else will use it. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to expose someone publicly to reclaim dignity. And you don't have to hate someone to leave them. The most irreversible decisions I made were the quietest ones. No slammed doors, no revenge, no humiliation, just documentation, preparation, action. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it too. So I'll leave you with a question. If you discovered the truth about someone you loved, not through drama, but through patterns, would you react immediately? Or would you wait until you understood the full picture before deciding who you want to be in the aftermath? I'm listening.